I really didn't think I had a lot to say about this movie until I sat down to write the review, so let's just jump into it with a deep dive of everything I thought about Rebel Moon Part 2 Scargiver. I really got a Lord of the Rings Two Towers vibe from this movie, and because Lord of the Rings was so important to me in like formative high school years, there was part of my heartstrings that were just automatically pulled and drawn into the story, even though Rebel Moon Part 2 does nothing to earn that emotional feeling. I'm also quite fond of the sets. In Part 2, we are stuck mostly on the Grain Planet, which is kind of like boring-ish, but they do a good job with what it is. And you know, when we finally get inside the Dreadnought, the choices there were deliberate and interesting. Like, they have all these cranks and manual elements to it that are very reminiscent of like a World War II submarine. I also noticed that like the wire holder at the core where Cora places all of the bombs looked like a robot face, and like the blue was going into their head and the red wires were coming out of their mouths and their eyes were closed. And that made me like wonder a lot of things, like because the blue light was very similar to the light that the princess gave off when she died and when she did healing. I was wondering if this is like an energy source that they harvest and need and utilize in different ways. It did make me wonder if the Dreadnought at some point in time was sentient, specifically because we do know about the robots and it seems like there aren't mechanics for them anymore and they failed their mission. So did they like fall asleep? Like, what is going on with that? The blue and red coloring of the wires is similar to the actual robots, like blue eyes and red sensors that we learned are like threat assessment. And none of this has any application in the movie we're watching right now. Kudos to the set that it's making me think about these kind of things and actually believe we're in a real world with like rules and lore and other interesting stuff for me to do. And I still love the character design. In this movie, we didn't get any new costumes, but since we are getting a ton of backstory about like the various characters, we do actually get to see the worlds they're in and make sense of some of the outfits they're wearing. It was like a nice full circle moment, even if I didn't love the exposition dump element of it, and I would have liked it maybe in reverse, or like to have gotten this information the same time I got the costume. The slow-mo scenes are still mostly pretty cool. Generally speaking, I like the way Zack Snyder shoots and films and directs. And that's all on display here in this movie. The scene between Cora and General Atticus Noble and Gunner is possibly like one of the best scenes in the whole movie. I love when the ship is falling and they're like fighting in like this dynamic environment. We're getting 360 views and they're holding on to things, and it's just really excellent. This time around, I'm gonna give Gunner the seal of approval. I liked his character. He did a full arc. He went from being like a coward to brave, from only being focused on the community to having a specific person he was fighting for and cared about more than anything else. And eventually Gunner actually sacrifices his life so that Cora can keep living and fighting another day. You already know I didn't buy their chemistry or like love or anything like that, but if this is the story we're giving Gunner, then I like it, and I love that we have the balls to kill this guy off. Because there is such a hard time connecting with these characters, feeling what they're feeling, believing they're feeling these things, I think a lot of people are probably gonna like shoulder shrug this moment. Imagine if in the original Star Wars New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi doesn't die when he fights Darth Vader, he just like disables the guy and gets away. So now he's able to keep training Luke and building that like mentor relationship. The two of them are closer. Because of this, Luke has a much easier time shooting out the Death Star, but instead of being able to like escape before the whole thing explodes, he gets caught in the blast and dies. And now we're left with Obi-Wan Kenobi surviving and having to like continue the mission that Luke does in the original trilogy. You know, that would be a metal as fuck premise, to kill our main character off and leave the mentor there holding the bag, having to finish the job. Like, instead of passing the torch off, we're seeing the true horrors of war. We're getting like this reverse element. It would yank the carpet out from underneath the audience. And in a lot of ways, Rebel Moon is doing that with Gunner. It's just that we don't have the same emotional connection or organic moments that we got in something like Star Wars. In Scargiver, the bad guys are officially a convoluted mess. Is the Mother World bad? Is the Regent bad? Is the Monarchy bad? Is it a yes and situation? I don't really understand why we bothered with like this changeover in how the Mother World was governed if it's been bad the whole time. And I think there's an argument to be made that it has always been bad because under the Mother World, Korra's planet was destroyed. Millie, that rando rebel fighter's planet, also destroyed. Her people were separated and enslaved into work camps. And General Titus became disillusioned with his post. I don't think he rebels until after the Regent takes over, but that's not 100% clarified, so I'm counting it here. And this issue with the monarchy like further convolutes the story of the princess. Is she just born good, or all of the monarchy born good? If the king wanted to stop war for whatever reasons, why couldn't he do this without her? It invites a lot of questions, and in a story that's supposed to be like a grim, dark, like grittier version of Star Wars, having a princess born who's pure goodness and light and transforms everything to the light side is a very fucking Disney-esque take. Moving into Admiral Atticus Noble, I guess he's just a bad, greedy dude who wanted a seat on the Senate. But even knowing all of that, like, not all of his actions make sense. He's just like a cartoonishly evil dude for no apparent reason. As far as character building goes, he loses the stick and picks up one of those fake sword lightsabers, which, you know, makes for a better fight scene, so I get it. But at the same time, why did we have his trademark weapon gimmick in the first half of this be the stick? Why didn't he always just have a distinctive lightsaber-y thing? And lastly, you know, I'm disappointed there's no Belisarius cameo here. I also feel somehow cheated in the fact that we got Belisarius at the end of the first movie because he is so much more threatening and powerful than anything else happening on the bad guy's side. And I really wanted him and Korra to face off. It would have provided like really good resolution for their relationship. It would have sealed what happened to the Mother World. Even if we'd just gotten like some kind of projection of Belisarius sort of like calling for his daughter, Korra knowing that eventually she has to face him, better than the nothing that we got. And moving on to the good guys, starting with Korra. I don't know if I get used to her, or if she got less screen time, or if she's actually getting better in her role as Korra, but I did find like her dialogue in social interactions in this movie to be less cringe and awful than they were in the first one. I sort of suspect that we just have less of them, period, because this is mostly a long drawn out battle scene, so she doesn't get a lot of one-on-one combos. But you know what? I'll take a win where there is one. Her character continues to be a super convoluted mess, but at least at this point I'm convinced that's by design and not by accident. I kind of appreciate that she is basically like a confused, lost, stereotypical, convoluted, tortured male hero, except a woman happens to be playing them. But I gotta keep it real, when we see like the tortured, broody male hero who is just doesn't know what they want and is acting against their self-interest and just lashes out at people around them, I don't like that character, so I don't really care for Korra either. And I am supremely confused by the decision-making process Korra goes through. Like, let's say, for the sake of argument, that she graduates the military academy at 19, and within the first year on the war front she loses her lover. It probably takes her another 3 years to rise up the ranks and get the role where she is now guarding the princess. So that puts her at 22 when she's on guard duty. And it probably takes another year of her on guard duty with the princess, experiencing things with her to start believing in her, having hope again. And that's when her adopted father Belisarius comes in and says like,
"Hey, we gotta kill this bitch to protect the Mother World."
No explanation given. There's nothing here that says forged a good connection or built trust. So it's very weird that she agrees to do this thing for him. And then when you combine that with the fact that she like somehow loves and feels loyalty to the princess, it's even more odd she doesn't try to like warn the family, run away with the princess, refuse to kill the princess when the crucial moment comes down to it. Who the princess is, who the Mother World is, and what all those politics and dynamics mean, what it means to Korra in the larger context of all these other other groups, her being the murderer of the princess, like, we know the robot's not cool with it, but other than that, this extra detail or like extra gritty element doesn't mean anything. And it just invites a lot of like confused interactions instead of clarifying things and giving strong motivations. Moving into Tarek, as far as I'm concerned, he is the weakest backstory here. Korra's backstory is confusing. Tarek's makes no sense and actually makes his character less likable and less able to relate to. Him saying that he had the burden of being born into a royal family, just fuck all the way off. Him talking like he had no choices, no, I'm sorry, my guy. You had all of the choices. The fact that he abandoned the griffin on that one planet where he was like a prisoner, was that his companion griffin? What was his and his people's relationships with griffins? Because it seems to be complex and like emotional and mental in some capacity. So that just blew my mind and made me think like,
there he goes again, abandoning the last citizen besides himself of his home world to this guy.
The whole thing was insane. Moving into Nemesis, her backstory, perfection. The fact that she cut off both her arms so that she could wield these weapons and get her revenge, that is some intense stuff. And it speaks to where her head was when everyone in her planet was murdered. And since she was part of a society that had been warlike and moved into a peaceful phase, intentionally regressing to get this revenge. Very sad and poignant and intense. That said, they did her dirty on that fight scene, and I feel like all of that arc and that information and learning and like potentiality went nowhere when they just killed her callously off for, I don't know, because they needed some more tension in these scenes, I guess. Titus's character got a major personality facelift. He's one of the few characters who gets his facelift through actual interactions and speeches he has with the regular people and with all the other people in the fight party. Like, I didn't find his flashback particularly compelling, and we could have skipped it. The robot's over here now because he's just fucks all the way off for the rest of this movie, really. He gets a scene in the last fight, and he has an awkward speech with Korra, and none of them mean anything. So I just don't even know what to talk about when it comes to him. I was really looking forward to him, and I didn't get it. Y'all, this was the craziest, slowest fucking start I've ever seen. Almost to the minute. The pacing is exactly the same in part 2 as it was in part 1. Usually that kind of consistency and cohesiveness between part 1 and part 2 would be something I'd praise, but it's awful. I don't want it. Nobody wanted this. It's kind of baffling here in part 2 because they start with a verbal exposition dump the same way they did in the first one. Only this time, since they can't give you all this lore drop about the mother world, they just summarize what happened to you in the first movie. How fucking disrespectful. Either watch that piece of shit or don't. But do not summarize it for those lazy latecomers here in the first two and a half minutes of the movie. And that moves me into my complaint about exposition and various plots and scenes here. Thankfully, there's a lot less dialogue here in Rebel Moon Part 2 since they did it so poorly in Part 1, which is why I've swapped it to exposition and plot points here in the bad side, but just know it's not getting like more entertaining really. For 40 minutes, there's nothing but farm scenes. And some of the farm scenes are fine, but 40 minutes is a lot of time. And when we get to the 40-minute mark, what do? We hear everyone's backstory. The same way in Rebel Moon Part 1, we got Korra's backstory. There's no tension. Thought it was like ham-fisted and kind of a tacky way to give us lore. Finally get a play-by-play with what happened to the princess. And you know I'm not super into it because it's part of the Gunner Korra love story. But I was so interested in this scene. I wanted to know so bad what the deal was with this princess. I almost didn't care. Me and my husband watched this movie together, right? And we sat through it, and he just likes to watch things from beginning to end and not talk about them, which is part of how you guys get these information dumps, right? He paused the movie and turned to me when we were done with that scene and said,
What the fuck did we just watch?
and I had to be like,
You know, hon, it's the war orphan who was ruled by a cruel person, went through a dehumanizing military camp, lost the love of her life, began guarding this princess, found hope and peace in her guardian role. Her cruel father comes back into the mix. She agrees to murder this girl on his behalf and then shoots her at point blank range. That father figure turns on her and she flees.
And my husband's like,
And he blamed this on her. Why? Like, she just passed the biggest loyalty test ever. They could have pinned it on anyone. Or they could have just pinned it on a person who doesn't even exist and, like, sent the army out hunting for them. And that could be part of the reason Atticus Noble's out here after the rebels.
I have to assume that things went down exactly this way so that the movie could movie.
and that's when he laughed and was like,
This is a terrible set of movies, and I'm not watching the third one with you.
so disappointed there. Really let us down, Rebel Moon. Then we finally get to the battle, which is most of the movie, I guess, and I genuinely didn't like it. To be fair, this maybe should have gone in the meh section because I don't really like action, set piece, war elements in general, and it could just be a me issue. But here's the thing, if like half of your movie is that, then I kind of have to judge it. The scenes go on way too long, they're very cringy. The whole like down in the hole slow motion thing doesn't work for me. Like that should all be happening really quickly. What they did for Nemesis' fight scene was awful. This woman supposedly learned all this ancient fighting technology from the robotic prosthetics where she gave up her ability to touch to do this. And she successfully assassinated, what, was it like 6 high-ranking people in the mother world? So she should have been like hiding up there in the rafters and coming down and slashing them. That would have been cool. When you draw the circle in the sand, that means you're not going to move and you're just going to kill everyone who comes your way. We could have had that. We didn't have that. Very disappointing, poorly set up way for her to die. Putting aside that Nemesis, I think, was the most compelling character and probably shouldn't have died, if you are going to kill her, it should be epic. It shouldn't be like her struggling, barely getting her hits in against these menfolk. This is one of the elements of her character that felt very sexist because it sort of felt like they were saying she couldn't beat these people because they were all men and she was a woman. Like there was some kind of implicit bias in the way they were doing the fight scenes, which sounds crazy because Cora's a woman and she's kicking ass and taking names all the time, but for some reason that doesn't translate over into Nemesis. And I wondered if part of it was that Nemesis is the quote unquote like mother character. You know, she lost her children, she has some kind of weird attachment to this one blonde boy child. And I'm not saying that a character can't have a loss of a child be their driving force, but it does feel very stereotypical. And then like they sort of pigeonholed her into this motherhood revenge role and not like really pulling it off in a successful way when she was going to get her last goodbye fight scene. The funerals at the end are just like another exposition dump of stupidity. And how the hell is the princess still alive? We watched her get shot at point blank range. I'm not into it. I'm not buying it. I don't know how they're going to explain that in a way that makes sense in a science fiction opera. Like that is just pure fantasy. And I don't necessarily mind when science fiction and fantasy blend together, but they're not really doing the science fiction element or the fantasy element very well. And they're also not doing like this gritty element well, or this epic element, or even like a fairy tale element. Like it's all just like little snippets of different things coming together in what feels like a cobbled together, very hollow mess. Which I guess brings me to my last complaint, which is going to be the title, Rebel Moon Part 2, Scar Giver. Who the hell did Cora scar to be called the Scar Giver? The closest I could come to making sense of this is that she scarred the mother world when she killed the king, queen, and princess, right? Like she left a lasting mark on their society as a whole. But they could do something to better like elucidate that, or they could have just made it very literal. And when we saw Belisarius the last time, have him have a huge fucking scar in his face. But as it stands now, I don't know why they keep calling her that, and I certainly don't know why the title of the movie is that. Just very frustrating. So wrapping this up and talking about how I plan to interact with Rebel Moon going forward. I am gonna watch the Snyder R cuts for part 1 and part 2 when they finally release, because I have to know if this is a bad movie because it's PG-13 and it's like hodgepodge together from pieces that don't make sense without context, or if the whole thing just sucks and I can give up on Zack Snyder as like a director when he doesn't have someone else's script work. But I do not know if I will be watching the next parts of Rebel Moon. Some of you guys might know this was originally supposed to be Rebel Moon, a 3-part series with a 2-part open, so really 4 parts. But they got so many views that part 2 is going to be broken into 2 parts, and part 3 is going to be broken into 2 parts, making what should have been 4 movies 6. And I am not prepared to watch 6 movies. I'm vaguely curious about the princess. I'm still vaguely hopeful something somewhere will happen with the robot. But here's the thing. I came into Scargiver pretty excited, actually, based off of some of the good and promising elements in part 1. And Scargiver actually made everything that happened in part 1 superfluous and stupid and made me feel dumb for watching it. And I'm like afraid that each movie will kind of like continue to prove that the one before it didn't need to exist. And that's gonna make me mad because that's a lot of time and effort to spend watching, reviewing, doing something with that media. So I don't know, I guess it will depend on what I see in the R versions. And even then, I think I'll only be watching the R versions if I watch anything going forward. But talk to me, what did you think about Rebel Moon Scargiver? And are you still interested in watching either the PG-13 sequels or the Snyder R cuts when they release? Let me know in those comments down below. Thanks for sticking with me on this review. I am still putting together something for a workshop so there's a little bit more Rebel Moon content coming out. So leave me a like on this video and let me know if you have any pitch ideas you'd want to see incorporated. And as always, keep reading. Bye!